morning, everyone. I would like to say how delighted I am to be here. I would like to thank the Ministry of Culture and also to everyone from Fujian Catholic University who they've all made me feel very welcome. This is my first time, like Valerie, in Taipei, and I'm so excited to have a chance to share with you some projects that I've worked on at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And so the Victoria and Albert Museum was founded in 1852, and it's one of Britain's national museums, but it calls itself the world's leading museum of design and performance. And so I hope that through some of the projects that I'm going to show you today, you'll get a sense of what that means in terms of fashion curation. So here is our grand facade, a great Victorian building, as I mentioned, built in 1852. And fashion has been very much a part of the V&A's collecting since its founding. But in the very beginning, most garments were collected because of the value of their textiles. Since the museum opened, though, it took some time for fashion as we would conceive of it today, that is, clothes designed as fashionable dress rather than, say, ceremonial dress or ecclesiastical attire. It took some time for fashion to be incorporated into our permanent galleries. Now I'm showing you this photograph of the so-called Octagon Court. And this is a photograph taken in the 1920s, and this is where our permanent fashion gallery is located today. And here you see it after a renovation. This is one of our display cases in the gallery. And over the years, we have refurbished or updated this fashion gallery several times. But unfortunately, we haven't yet been able to secure new display cases, which is one of the crucial elements in making a fashion exhibition or a fashion display look lively and contemporary and interesting. And so I hope that the next time you come to visit, we will have a new fashion gallery because we're hoping that we're going to get the money to have new display cases and new lighting to make it look lively and attractive. Now, the fashion gallery is a very important part of our public program because this is what we call a permanent display of fashion that rotates every so often with new material, but it's open every day of the year, it's free, and it showcases European and North American fashion from around 1750 to the present day. The Victoria and Albert Museum has clothes that date from earlier than this period, but many of them are very fragile, or they're not in good enough condition to withstand the rigors of display. And I wanted to mention a little bit about the permanent gallery before I move on to exhibitions, because the V&A is very much a resource for the creative industries in London. And it's really important that fashion designers, fashion students, and academics have a place to come where they can see a basic chronology of fashionable dress to understand a little bit about the history of fashion. So this is the only place in London which offers this kind of reference. And the Fashion Gallery is a very popular and often visited location within the museum. I'm going to move on just quickly now to some projects that I've worked on. But before I start talking to you about this display, Aussie Clark, which was my first display as a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I'm just going to frame my talk this morning with a few points that I would like you to keep in mind, and I hope that my talk is going to cover these points. And one of them is that fashion at the V&A is now programmed into a variety of spaces. It's no longer just in the fashion gallery. There are exhibitions in a very small display area in the fashion gallery, but it's also programmed into our major exhibition halls. Another point that my talk touches on this morning is the fact that fashion exhibitions have become a big attractor of major sponsorship for the museum. And fashion curation today, I think that all of my colleagues would agree with me, is no longer just about exhibition making. It's also about the business of running museums. And that always now includes thinking about what corporations or funding sources might be interested in supporting your exhibition projects. Another point that I would like to mention is that I'll be referencing briefly, and something that Valerie mentioned also, is the fact that exhibitions often prompt donations of objects. So somehow when you have an exhibition about underwear or an exhibition about British fashion, a lot of people look through their closets and think, aha, I have one of those, perhaps the museum would like it. And it's a wonderful situation to be in, that you often find yourself being offered, or the museum being offered, donations prompted by your exhibition program. And I think that another thing that will come out in my talk, I hope, is that exhibition making and fashion projects continually move the bar upward in terms of setting audience expectation. And one thing I think you'll see, I hope in my talk, is that the visitor expectation now, when they come to see fashion exhibitions at the V&A, their expectations now are no longer satisfied with just a few dresses and a bit of information about what you're seeing. Visitors expect spectacle. And then the last thing I wanted to say that I hope kind of runs right through my talk is that fashion exhibitions have, particularly in recent years, continued to increase the level of scholarship in our field. And I think that it's so important, even though we've come a long way from, as Valerie mentioned, the early years of curating fashion exhibitions where fashion was considered to be outside of the academy and not worthy of being inside the Howard Halls of Fine Art museums. I do still think that there are some battles to fight, and we can never be complacent. We always have to be moving the field of research and scholarship forward. So those are the kind of things that I'd like you to keep in mind as I'm going through my talk. And I'm really delighted for people to, in the question and answer session, to challenge me and ask questions about anything that I've been presenting today. So please hold your questions in your minds as I'm going through. So as I mentioned, this display was the first exhibition that I worked on at the V&A. And I came to the V&A actually by chance, by good fortune, because I started my career in London as a student at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where I did an MA in the history of dress, hoping that one day I might get a job at the V&A. So I have a guardian angel on my shoulder. I feel really fortunate to be at an institution with such a fantastic collection, but also with amazing colleagues who have really paved the way in terms of my own career, but also creating some wonderful and memorable exhibition projects. So I owe a huge debt to a very large number of colleagues, and I guess I'm here as one person from the V&A representing a really large department of fashion curators. So this project, Ozzie Clark looked at a British designer who was really at the peak of his career in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And the exhibition took place in the fashion gallery in our small display area, which at that time was just on a single level. And it featured around 60 dresses from this one designer. And it was a very, what I would call a modest display. So it's not very big, and it didn't have very many loans. We had some loans from his former business manager, but we also focused very much on the V&A's permanent collection, so objects that we owned in our own museum. And I wanted to show you this image because it was one of the first times that the V&A included film in a fashion exhibition. And it came about at a very last minute. our director called me up 2 weeks before the opening and said, we have a few extra £100. What can you do to make this exhibition really special? And so I thought, well, I've seen this great film footage of a fashion show of Aussie Clarks, and we'll include that because it's got images of the Beatles attending, and there's people smoking and people dancing. It was a great little film clip. And it was a very small, kind of short, 30 seconds, but it introduced the visitor to the kind of party atmosphere that the Aussie Clark entourage was all about. And it was a bit of an experiment, but it looks so funny now. It looks so old-fashioned, this tiny little moment in the exhibition with just a short 30-second film clip. But it was the beginning, for me, of what is now a routine element in fashion exhibitions, which is we always include the moving image. It's so important for our visitor. And you can see our very old-fashioned display cases, which we've come to be very used to, unfortunately. And this gives you a window into the exhibition, and you can see there's a little bit of textiles, there's a few garments on display with some very modest exhibition labels. I show you this image because at this time, having the opening party attended by Kate Moss, I considered this to be the highlight of my career at the time. I really thought I'd made it as a fashion curator. And I think it's hard to overestimate the importance for my museum, the role that the opening party plays in an exhibition's lifespan. Because, you know, the V&A is very much, even though it's a cultural institution, it's run in some ways like a business. And the opening party attracts press attention because celebrities come, they endorse the exhibition, they tell their friends, they post it on Instagram. And this is the moment when we gain a lot of public attention for the beginning of an exhibition, which then encourages people to come. So exhibitions within my institution are very much the engine of our business model. We're open every day except Christmas, and there are lots of permanent galleries, like the Fashion Gallery and other galleries, for visitors to see. But the thing that really drives our business model, the real engine, as we call it, of our institution, are our temporary exhibitions. So the opening party, the opening event, is not just the launch, but it's also the moment to capture press and public attention to encourage people to come. So the next exhibition I wanted to mention is another show that I worked on in 2007 called New York Fashion Now. And as a North American by birth, I wanted to attract British attention to designers who perhaps the British audience might not know very well. And this exhibition focused on a group of emerging designers who came to prominence or kind of started their business around the millennium. And I think what was so poignant for many of them was the fact that a lot of this generation of designers, their early careers were really shaped by the 9/11 attacks in New York, where in that year, Fashion Week kind of fell right in the middle of the attacks, and many young designers' shows were canceled or were framed or started or ended around that time. So the years after were really difficult for fashion in New York. And so a number of the designers featured had shown incredible determination in persisting with their businesses, because as we know, the fashion business is a really tough industry to be in. And so for the British public, some of these designers were new, some were more established than others, people like Zac Posen and Prince Schuler, and also, of course, by the time the exhibition opened, some of the designers had already gone out of business. But I included them anyway, because I think it's important to remind the public just how fragile the ecosystem of the fashion industry is. And here's two designs by Tom Brown, a menswear designer, because we included both men's fashion as well as women's. And we commissioned a graphic designer to create a really interesting logo, or kind of a logo for the exhibition poster and for the book jacket as well. And here's a view into one of the display cases with an outfit by Prenza Schuler. And I think for me too, as an American, it was really affirming to be able to showcase designs by a group of young emerging New York designers and also acquire some of them for the V&A's permanent collection. Because the V&A is a London institution with really clear and obvious ties to Paris as the kind of historic fashion capital of the world, our permanent collection is very heavily biased towards London and Paris designers. Very, very few examples of North American fashion exist in the V&A's permanent collection. So I used this exhibition project as an excuse, as a vehicle, to acquire some of the designs that were featured in the exhibition. And because of building up a really nice relationship with the designers that we included, many of them were incredibly generous and donated things to the V&A. So I wanted to also mention this exhibition, Ball Gowns, British Glamour Since 1950, which I co-curated with my colleague, Oriel Cullen. And this exhibition was programmed in the Olympic year in 2012, which meant that the entire V&A was taken over by all things British. So we, because it was also the Queen's Jubilee, we were celebrating everything to do with Britain. The other big exhibition that was on at the same time was called British Design, and it looked at all aspects of British design history, from cars to cutlery. And so this exhibition on British evening wear was on at the same time. And this was, I'm going to be really honest with you, this exhibition was not something that I woke up one day and said, oh my God, I have to do an exhibition on ball gowns. The exhibition on New York designers was really a project of passion. This exhibition was really a pragmatic project. So we had to do something British, we had to do something popular, and everyone loves a ball gown. So we decided to focus on British evening wear. And in fact, it ended up being a really enjoyable project to work on because I was able to co-curate it with a colleague who I really value and admire. And I think it's also a lot of fun to share the curation of a project because you bounce ideas off of each other, you have a comrade, you share the burden and the responsibilities, but it's also just a lot more enjoyable. And so with this photograph, you can see that the exhibition is where we've kind of moved on in the fashion gallery from those first images I showed you to the inclusion of a mezzanine within the fashion gallery exhibition space. So this double height space really actually did double the footprint of our exhibition space. So we got a lot more room to show more clothes. It's a little bit of an awkward solution because you, as the visitor, you first kind of tour the downstairs area, then you have to walk up a set of stairs to see the second half of the show. There is an elevator, there is a lift, but it's not very reliable. So if you have mobility problems, sometimes the lift doesn't work, so sometimes people aren't able to see the second half of the show. The other challenge is the fact that you can see the mezzanine is very open. There are now some display cases in the upstairs area, but in the past it's meant that dust, which is always the challenge for exhibitions of dress, dust is a real problem. But with challenges aside, we had this wonderful opportunity to use for the first time this double height space. And we wanted to take a little bit of a risk with the exhibition design. So we commissioned a early career designer named Emily Pugh to do the set. And it was a risk because she had never worked on a fashion exhibition or a museum project before. Previously, she was a designer for shop windows. And of course, I think the wonderful thing about that as a discipline is that you have to capture the attention of the passerby in your approach, and very clever. So Emily created what I would call a whimsical, kind of almost surreal-like setting with these enormous canopies suggesting a garden party. And you can just about see that those very large balls that are on the floor were meant to suggest an oversized pearl necklace that you might wear with your ball gown. The chandelier that you see is actually made of plywood, painted white, and included lights inside it. So it's a functioning light fixture, but was made with very simple, inexpensive materials. She also, for the downstairs portion of the exhibition, where we are always still having to deal with these very old-fashioned display cases, she made them into little room settings made out of plywood furniture that she painted, and again, light fixtures that worked. So very light-hearted, whimsical setting. The garments were actually grouped according to their color, because with lots of tiny display cases, it was hard to make them look good. When you have 50 years of evening wear, of course, decade by decade, the tastes and the silhouettes changed dramatically. So the easiest thing was to group them by color. Again, this was a kind of decision that was made for practical reasons more than anything else. And here you get a view onto the mezzanine that shows the garments on display. It shows the supersized canopies and chandeliers, along with Emily's really, I think, really whimsical, oversized pearls, and some footprints on the floor suggesting dancing moves, because of course a lot of these gowns were intended to be worn for evening. And some of the designers that we included not only were the kind of highlights of the post-war period, but on the mezzanine we were looking at London-based designers from the present day, not just well-known names like Vivienne Westwood and Alexander McQueen, but also designers who were then on the ascendant, people like Erdem and Roxanda Ilincic, who perhaps were born elsewhere but based their labels in London after having gone to design school there. So it was really a kind of celebration of 50 years of British evening wear. We also included sort of emerging names at that time, someone like Gareth Pugh, who created this dress for us based on an example from his from one of his existing collections, which he made from a cocktail dress into a full-length evening gown of silvery neoprene. So some very surprising and unusual examples, as well as some things that were more traditional. And I wanted to just show you the book jacket of our publication, because I wanted to use this as a moment to mention how important it is for us to create exhibition publications as part of the project life cycle. And I think the challenging thing for the V&A curators is that because of our printing processes, we have to submit our label text, our book text about a year before the exhibition opens. So in terms of the life cycle of the project, usually we would start working on an exhibition between 2 to 3 years before we open. And so just when you're trying to finalize your object list about a year or 9 months before the exhibition opens, you're also supposed to be submitting your book to the printers or to the editors. So this makes for a very stressful time. But I think for those of us who've had the good fortune of having our publications published, I think they serve as a lasting record of exhibition projects, because you might spend 2 or 3 years working on a show, and then it's up for a few months, and then it's gone. And so this serves as a kind of a memory and a permanent record of all of the research that you've done and all of the objects that you've found, all of the things that you've included in the exhibition. And so we spend quite a bit of time, and we lavish a lot of love and attention on our publications. And I think for the ball gowns exhibition book, one of the things that we were able to do was to commission a photographer to create some of the images. As I said, I did not wake up one day and say, oh my God, I must do an exhibition on ball gowns. It was a fairly predictable project. So Oriel and I really wanted to make the book a bit more challenging. So I think I've got an image here. So we worked with fashion photographer David Hugh, who did a lot of work with fashion advertising to create images that were a little unusual. Because when the V&A photographers create images for our books, they basically do a straight studio shot because they need to showcase the objects with clarity and with precision. So we wanted David to do something a little bit more interpretive. So we asked him to work, he worked and ended up working with a props maker to create headdresses and installation pieces that added life to the images that he took. And so here, an Erdem dress is juxtaposed with a book that seems to be exploding with leaves, kind of referencing the really natural forms of flowers and leaves that trail across the skirt of the Erdem dress. So we had this wild week of photography where the props makers were out in the parking lot with glue guns and making fires to kind of burn the edges of the leaves, things you couldn't normally do in a museum. So we exported them outside to the parking lot to create these fantastical props that we then used in the photographs to just, again, try to make the book a little bit more challenging than perhaps the theme of the exhibition allowed. And I wanted to move on to an exhibition that I worked on in 2014, The Glamour of Italian Fashion. And unlike the ball gowns show, which although I did enjoy that project very much working with Oriel, this exhibition was a project of passion because the V&A hadn't ever really treated the history of Italian fashion in one major retrospective. And I had the wonderful experience when I was at university of doing a year's study abroad in Florence, in Italy. So I learned Italian. I learned to appreciate not just Italian style, but the kind of Italian approach to dressing, which was often about investing in important pieces, about a value of quality and craftsmanship, which I think I was really excited to share with the V&A public. And so I proposed this exhibition hoping that the museum would say yes, and obviously they did. And I had the good fortune of having 3 years of research time to work on this project. Now I think that's important to mention because that's something that I would say is really unique perhaps in the V&A, that we have something called the research department where you get basically a sabbatical from your normal job. All of the administrative work, the inquiries that we often get, the requests for talks and lectures, all of that is suspended, in theory, for the time that you are working on and delivering an exhibition. You move your office and your desk to the research department, and you're supposed to be uninterrupted for that period. And I think the reason why that we're able to do this is that my department of fashion and textiles has quite a number of curators who can absorb some of the work that you leave behind. So I was very lucky. I had 3 years full-time of working on this exhibition. I had a research assistant who was dual language Italian-British speaker. My Italian is good, but it's not perfect. And because we did quite a lot of research trips back and forth to Italy, it was wonderful to have someone to help with all of that work. It was also really fun. So I had to travel to Rome and Milan and Florence. It was really tough duty. And the exhibition really traced the history of Italian fashion from the post-war period to the present day. This is a subject that, surprisingly, at that time, had not even been examined in great detail in exhibitions in Italy. And so we were able to work with some of the Italian collections and museums to borrow pieces that we did not have. We were also able to work with many of the Italian fashion houses to borrow pieces from their archives. And it was a very humbling experience because the Italians were incredibly generous because they were very excited that their story was being told. And the exhibition, as I say, it started in the post-war period and examined the rise of Italian fashion from the years when it was first shown to an international public in the so-called Sala Bianca, or White Hall, where for the first time, really, international buyers and press could come to one location, and at that time it was in Florence, and see all of the designers' works on one single catwalk. Before this time, Italian fashion had no single fashion calendar, and fashion buyers and press had to travel from city to city, from Rome to Milan to Florence, to try to get an idea of that season's collections. So from 1951 onwards, there started to be a kind of more coordinated approach. And it was, for me, such a pleasure to be able to tell this story in London, using both some of the V&A's own collections, but also really key loans from Italian institutions. And I wanted to show this image and ask you to sort of think back to that first Ozzie Clark show photograph with that one moment of film, because this is just one gallery or one room in the Italian fashion exhibition, but you can see that we've moved a long way from the single film point to now, in this one particular moment, there are two enormous screens on either side of the gallery, each showing different film footage at the same time. So we've created now this kind of immersive, all-encompassing film moment. It's all the more important because this was a point in the exhibition talking about the influence of Rome and cinema, and also Hollywood films being shot on location in Rome. So it was essential that we not only showed film clips, but also still photography and fashion images of Hollywood actresses coming and going on and off the set. So we've really moved on quite dramatically, I think, from having one moment of film or a bit of film to now, I think in this exhibition, there was not a single moment or a single room in the show where there was not moving image, whether it was archival footage from newsreels to interviews with fashion designers to Hollywood film clips. There was moving image almost everywhere you stood. And this is where we've come now with fashion exhibitions. And one of the things that I like to perhaps hear from you in the Q&A session is what you think about that. And, you know, I wonder why if that's the case for fashion and perhaps not for other disciplines. You know, is it because fashion is meant to be seen on the moving body that we feel this kind of obligation to put moving image in the gallery accompanying the garments on display? And perhaps is there scope to moving back to exhibitions that are much simpler, and are our visitors now permanently trained to be expecting moving image as a filter for the objects that they're seeing? I'm not sure of the answer, but perhaps we can discuss that more in the Q&A. Now I wanted to pause here a moment because I mentioned that one of the things I'd be referencing today is this question of sponsorship, because now as a curator proposing an exhibition at the V&A, I am required to come to the presentation with my own suggestions for exhibition sponsors, my own ideas of companies, banks, consulting firms that might feel some synergy between their brand and the exhibition idea. So these are the companies that were at various times sponsors of the Italian fashion exhibition. And so I think it's a good case study to pause, to use to kind of pause for a moment and talk about sponsorship, because the sponsor will have, for a certain amount of money that a sponsor gives to the V&A, they will get in return a list of benefits. And those benefits could be hiring some of the public spaces for a reduced rate if they want to have a party. Those benefits could include a curator talk for their VIP clients, or probably more than one VIP talk for their clients. It could also include a certain number of tickets for their employees to come to the exhibition. So there's a whole list and sort of benefits that those sponsors receive in exchange for the money that they give. Sometimes an exhibition will have more than one sponsor. In the case of Italian fashion, the main sponsor when the exhibition was on in London was Bulgari, the Italian jewelry company. In addition, Nespresso, the coffee company, was what we call a second-tier sponsor. So they got to have their name on the poster. They also got a whole other range of benefits, but their logo was smaller. And they were very much a kind of what we call kind of second tier. So my development team, the fundraising team, works very hard to manage expectations when there are multiple sponsors, and also to make clear what the sponsors receive in exchange for their money. The logo in the middle, Nordstrom, is an American department store chain. Nordstrom became the sponsor of the exhibition when it toured to North America. It toured to 3 museums in the United States, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And across that entire tour, Nordstrom sponsored the exhibition. They had their logo on all the posters, and they sent representatives to the opening party for each of those venues. This is a sort of summary of the museums where the Italian fashion exhibition toured to. It started at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in Minnesota. It then traveled to the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon, and then to the Frist Center in Nashville, Tennessee. After that, the exhibition went into storage for some months. A number of the loans particularly from museums, which have a very short amount of time that they will agree to lend because they want to ensure that their garments are not damaged by being on display for too long. Some of the garments went back to their owners. We brought in some new garments as well, and we reconfigured the exhibition for the final venue, which was in Montreal. And that was at the McCord Museum in Montreal. As the exhibition curator, I had the good fortune of being invited to attend the opening of each of these exhibitions in each of the 4 venues. For me, that was one of the most gratifying aspects of the project because, as I mentioned earlier, when a show happens at the V&A, it's up for 3 months or 4 months, and then it comes down, and those 3 years of work are over. And it's very sad. I call it the post-project letdown when your exhibition closes. So to have the show travel on to 4 additional venues, even though it was slightly changed and there were some new garments on show, it gave new life to the project, but also the privilege of being able to work with 4 other institutions to learn what their visitors expected, what they enjoyed, to work with professionals from such different backgrounds in such different cities was so fascinating. And I also got a window into another part of what my institution does, I think, very well, which is how do you take an exhibition and tour it around the world. So it was a fascinating process. And not only did I go and attend the opening parties. But I also went early to each of these events so that I could help with the installation, so that I could meet members of the press in all of those cities and do interviews, but also so that I could give talks to the members of those museums. So I gave a public lecture, and that was also quite instructive because I felt like I got to know each of those cities and those constituents of the individual museums very well. Because it's a very big part now of what we do. And it's not just fashion. Of course, fashion is a big part of the museum's public program. And I think our fashion exhibitions have really helped to energize the V&A in the 15 plus years that I've been there. The museum has over tripled its visitor figures. When I arrived at the V&A, there were about 900,000 visitors a year, and today, on average, there are about 3.7 million visitors each year. And while fashion is not the only reason for this, I think it is a very big part of why the V&A has experienced this kind of renaissance. And so, because fashion is only part of what we do, it's only part of the exhibitions that we tour around the world. But this is an image of some of our activity. This is an image from 2014, so it's a little bit out of date, but it gives you a sense of where around the world we've toured some of our shows, from Brazil to Turkey to Japan, even in Taiwan, but a lot in Europe, Norway, Germany, Italy. We do a lot in the United States, partly because there are so many museums in the United States, so many big cities, that there is this potential for them to take a show from the V&A because it's expensive to do that, and it's also complicated. So we work hard to find venues that are able to afford our prices, to be very honest, and also that have the kind of environmental conditions that we require. And the reason why the United States also is one of the larger recipients of our exhibitions is that once an exhibition travels by ship to the United States, the hardest part and most expensive part of the tour is over. And so the museums, therefore, that take the show, the more of them that take the show, the cheaper it is, because they spread the cost of transportation amongst all of them. And the more that museums that take it, the cost decreases for each of them each time. So that's why, in part, my Italian fashion exhibition, once it got to the United States, it became easier for it to then tour to 3 venues, and then a 4th up in Canada. So these are not venues that just took fashion exhibitions. These, as I mentioned, are taking exhibitions of paintings, of prints and drawings, thematic shows, so all kinds of things. But our exhibitions department is the same, so the same group of people that put on shows in the V&A are the same people that take those shows on the road. So to give you an idea of some of the complexities of touring our fashion exhibitions, I'm showing you this Charles James wedding dress that was included in the wedding dress exhibition curated by my colleague Edwina Ehrman some years ago. And you can see that the wedding dress has a very long and elaborate train. So it's a very, not just fragile, but very complicated garment to pack for tour. And I think that the photograph that you see, what we call it the toaster rack that they built for the skirt, but it shows you how we travel our mannequins. So over the years, we've developed a method for packing our garments for transportation. And we find that if we do not undress them, they survive better because it's less handling. It's less fingers on the actual garments, it's less stress and strain on the seams. And so it's better for the garments to be traveled on their mannequins. But in order to do that, we have to go through a very elaborate process of ensuring that the mannequins themselves are super strong, that the packing material is sufficient to absorb any shock or stress. The mannequins are fixed inside the case with a kind of protective element on the head to ensure that the head is protected, but also the mannequin does not move. And a special cover is made for the garment. As you can see, our textile conservators have created a kind of special cover for the garment so that there is protection between the crate and the garment itself. So there are so many man-hours that have gone into making this garment ready for transportation, but it is the best thing for the sort of health of the garment, so those hours are justified. But this is partly why our shows are so expensive to take. Now, in the last sort of 15 minutes that remain, I'm going to mention another exhibition that you've already heard a little bit about in Valerie's talk. And this was an exhibition called Alexander McQueen Savage Beauty that was curated by Andrew Bolton at the Met, and that the V&A took and brought to London about 4 years later. This exhibition, for its V&A iteration, was curated by my colleague Claire Wilcox, and I was brought on board in the final 6 months of the project to absorb the chaos. There were 4 of us in the curatorial team, and there were, I think, 4 corporate sponsors, and each of those sponsors had their expectations. And so when I tell you that there were 230 talks and tours over the course of the exhibition that were absorbed by 4 people, it was a really chaotic but exciting and thrilling project. So we are now at a moment where our visitor is not just expecting moving image wherever they go, but they're expecting a complete and immersive exhibition experience. Every room in the V&A gallery had its own separate soundscape. Every room had film. There were 32 video points throughout the exhibition, with each, its own film clips running. So it was a completely overwhelming sensory experience. And I saw the exhibition in New York. I was lucky enough to get in before the public. And by the time I left, it had been open to the public. It was a complete and utter frenzy because it was such a phenomenon. And a similar thing happened when it came to the V&A, where it was the most visited exhibition we ever had. 480,000 people came to see it, which for us was kind of unprecedented. So really thrilling and overwhelming experience to be a part of. We did add a couple of sections within the V&A. That first image, this image I showed you was the first thing people saw, and it talked about McQueen's moment in London and his training in Central St. Martin's and some of the early collections that he created. So this was new to the V&A iteration of the show, and this kind of crypt-like installation was also new to the V&A show. It had about 30% more content, so it was slightly larger than the Met. So we tried to work very closely with Andrew Bolton to maintain the look and feel of the show. And in fact, the same craftspeople and exhibition makers that created the show in New York recreated it in London. So it did, I think, feel very much kind of like, for the visitor, like what they'd seen in New York. And this was perhaps the most, the kind of pinnacle moment of the exhibition, the so-called Cabinet of Curiosities, where the V&A was able to take advantage of our double-height space gallery and supersize the cabinet to, really take advantage of that height of the ceiling and film everywhere, as you can see. I think it's important to be really honest about the role of retail in our exhibitions. And the V&A does a brisk business in our shop, and our buyers create a unique product to sell for each exhibition that we create. So for the McQueen exhibition, we kind of did a bit of a makeover of our shop. We painted the floor to kind of distress it and make it look a bit more McQueen-like. And we created a whole range of products from inexpensive pencils to very expensive scarves. So we really, because our government funding is decreasing every year, and our staffing budgets reflect that, we need to work really hard to make up the difference. And so our sponsorship is incredibly important, but also the money that we make in our retail, in our shops is also really important. And that is the reality of museum work today. And it's certainly, you know, even though we're a big museum, we're a national museum, we have government support, that support is shrinking. And so we have to be creative in finding ways to, as I say, make up the difference. And I wanted to just include a brief bit of film that gives you a sense of the spectacle that the visitor experienced when they came to the Alexander McQueen exhibition. So that's just, again, a sense of some of the video material that the visitors would have seen when they came to the Alexander McQueen exhibition. And I think, just moving on from that, I wanted to briefly mention in closing that the V&A is now incredibly ambitious in terms of thinking about fashion exhibitions, its public program, all of the activities that we do beyond the four walls of the V&A in South Kensington in London. Just in November, you may realize that we opened a branch gallery in Shenzhen called Design Society. And here's an image of it here. And I was just visiting there earlier in the week for the first time. And this exhibition space will take shows from the V&A in South Kensington. And we'll also be creating shows for them specifically. It's another venue outside of London where our shows will be featured, among them fashion exhibitions. And so I think the dialogue potential between the V&A and the museum in Shenzhen is really, really fascinating. Later on this year, the V&A is opening another branch in Dundee in Scotland, and that will showcase a permanent exhibition of Scottish design, but also temporary shows. So we'll be looking to the north as well, and the dialogue potential there is quite interesting. And our ambitions for taking over the world continue with another institution branch opening in East London in 2023. And at the moment, it's a brown site, but you can see the pink outline of where the museum will be, along with some other institutions who will be opening new sites there, including Sadler's Wells Dance Company, and also the University of the Arts London will have a campus on the same location. This is in the former Olympic Park, and the emphasis in terms of London construction and London life and pulse is really moving towards East London. And so I think the dialogue potential between South Kensington, which is the traditional heart of many of the museums in London, I think the dialogue between us in South Kensington and our future home, our satellite home in East London is really exciting. So fashion is going to be moving east as well. So I think that comes to the end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to later in the Q&A to some of your responses and your questions and your challenges to me. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for your attention.